Come along. Quiet in the cheap seats. Oh, do come along. We haven't got all day. I think, bearing in mind Africa time, we can count this as a success. We're only 6 minutes late. My God, let's try that again. We're only 6 minutes late. All right, whenever they ask you to do one of these things, you always end up having to do the housekeeping announcements. The housekeeping. What are the housekeeping? Well, for example, 2 housekeeping notes for you. Firstly, those involved with the exhibition stands downstairs, the judging for the exhibition stands will take place at 5:15. Does that mean anything to anyone? I'm just worried that we'll have the results tomorrow in another award ceremony. And the second one, and listen, you all owe me. There is a raffle or some sort of tombola tomorrow where there's a prize. Now, originally, cheapskate Neil Gopal had intended to give you a prize of 10,000 rand in the raffle. I'm sorry. My God, you're a cheap date. Well, I was on a game drive yesterday, More Animals, and I said, 10,000 rand, how much is that? And when I worked it out, it just about bought me dinner at home. So I said, that wasn't a lot of money. He was duly shamefaced because his wife was sitting next to him. And having had a quick word with his financial controller, who's really the boss and wears the trousers, the 10,000 has become 30,000. Let's try that again. The 10,000 has become 30,000. Which will now buy dinner for 2 where I come from. But here's the point. Here's the catch. You've got to be here to win it tomorrow. So if we pull your name out of the hat or electronically, and you're not here. Hard cheese, sir, correct. Hard cheese. Now, this gentleman over here was talking to me at lunchtime about, I was asking why nobody asked any questions at this morning's panel. He didn't really have a good answer, but it does mean, as we move through the afternoon on this next panel, I do need you to take part. And frankly, if you do not take part in this afternoon's panel and discussion, well, you're a dead loss. Because this is an exciting one. This is absolutely what you've all been waiting for. If we talked about elephants in the living room, today we unleash the elephants. And the elephants don't come much bigger than Tony Leon. Now, you know Tony Leon much better than I do. Member of Parliament for 20 years, leader of the opposition, part of the constitutional negotiations, and most recently, the Honourable Ambassador to Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. When they make you an ambassador, they're trying to make an honest man of you. But there are few people for whom it can be said, as it is of Tony Leon by Nelson Mandela, your contribution to democracy is enormous. Frankly, ladies and gentlemen, if Nelson Mandela says that about anybody and it goes on your tombstone, that is worthy of an epitaph. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honourable Ambassador Tony Leon.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, Dr. Moseneke, President of SAPOA, Mr. de Klerk, the incoming President of SAPOA. South Africa now has a new President, de Klerk. Mr. You never thought that would happen again. Mr. Neil Gopal, Chief Executive Officer, Directors, National Councillors, Regional Councillors of SAPOA affiliates, and honorary life members, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Fresh, as you heard from Richard, from my stint as a South African ambassador abroad, I would, according to the diplomatic rule book at this point, say of the proceedings, all protocols observed. And indeed, before I commit some egregious further error, the Mayor of Cape Town, my former colleague in Parliament, Patricia de Lille, and the Mayor of Johannesburg, Councillor Parks Tau. But I cannot say all protocols observed, because you might have noticed that South Africa has been gupted, and we don't currently have a chief of protocol because he's been suspended as a consequence of the monsoon wedding which rained down here, right here in Sun City, just 2 weeks ago. You might also be interested to know, this is not a joke incidentally, that not every Indian High Commissioner in the world has the surname Gupta. And in fact, the very wise advice I was given at the start of my ambassadorship over 3.5 years ago in Buenos Aires came from the Indian ambassador to Argentina, Vish Viswanathan. And he told me that the essence of being an ambassador is to think twice and then say nothing. I have, however, discarded his caution today in case you feel slightly shortchanged. And in this address, what I'm going to try and do is to share some thoughts on the essential question, where in the world is South Africa going forward? But before I offer some views on this serious matter, allow me to thank SAPOA for this invitation. Yesterday in Johannesburg, I went to a meeting, and the parking attendant scanned his list, looked at me quizzically and the names on it, and said, "Tony Leon, I thought you were dead." Well, when I pointed out to the contrary that I was very much alive, he responded immediately, "Well, I haven't seen you on TV for a long time, so I assumed you'd passed away." You will readily understand that this sort of conversation never ever happens to Richard Quest. Now, I didn't have time to explain to him, but let me share with you that I've spent the last 3+ years as South Africa's ambassador to Argentina, a very enriching and somewhat challenging experience about which a book appears outside, should you be interested. I did, however, tell the person who appointed me, President Zuma, when I met with him on my return last November, that I knew why he had sent me to Argentina. So the great man asked why, and I said, because it is worse governed and far more corrupt than South Africa. Now, as you can see from that picture, because he's very genial, the president laughed heartily. But he never offered me another appointment. So I am living proof of that old adage, if you want to appreciate your own country, go and live in another. Now, today here at home, we celebrate alongside you the 47th anniversary of the founding of the South African Property Owners Association, whose diverse membership controls 9/10 of all commercial and industrial property in South Africa, with a combined portfolio which is worth 150 billion rand. Now, I know that Dr. Moseneke, whom I was privileged to meet in the break at lunch, is himself, as so many of you are, involved and own and have positions in property. But here is a lady who is actually one of the biggest property owners in the world, Queen Elizabeth II. When she came to our country in 1995 and reflected on the huge distance that had passed between her visit here as a 21-year-old and her arrival back in a free and democratic South Africa, she made the important point that distance lends enchantment. And if you reflect back to the founding convention of this body, SAPOA, over 45 years ago, you will see the wisdom of her words. Back then, H.F. Verwoerd was Prime Minister of South Africa. And while South Africa was in the iron grip of apartheid, the world was at the heights, or indeed in the depths, of the Cold War struggle between the Soviet and American global powers. Democracy was the isolated exception on poverty-racked Africa, and Nelson Mandela was about to enter 27 years of a life sentence in prison. Of course, we lived through a lot of tumultuous history since then. We survived Dr. Verwoerd, P.W. Botha, and many other characters in between and since. Democracy today is the rule and not the exception on our continent, which, as you know, has recently been uprated by The Economist magazine from being the hopeless continent of a decade ago to being the hopeful continent of the future. Now, you will know and remember that one of the urgent questions always asked about our country is how long have we still got until it all explodes? Now, there are many opinions on the subject, and doubtless my distinguished co-panelists this afternoon will share their thoughts on this matter, as will I. But I always think wise and sage advice was given by the legendary South African journalist Steve Mulholland, who said recently, "Ever since I was 5 years old, I was always told South Africa had 5 years to go. Well, I'm now 80 and we are both still here." Now, you know, in South Africa particularly, but across the world, we always associate the word transformation with politics. But if you think about your own work and the way in which it is conducted today as opposed to how it was conducted at the very foundation of SAPOA, you will agree that the greatest and most sweeping changes in the world, perhaps the greatest revolution of modern times, has been from the world of technology. The basic smartphone in your pocket has famously more computing power in it than Apollo 11 had when its capsule landed on the moon back in 1969. I find it impossible to say to our children today that back then, on that auspicious day in world history, I was an 11-year-old in Durban. SAPOA, incidentally, was only 7 years old at the time. And in those pre-TV days, if you're old enough to remember them, we were all crouched round the family transistor listening to the crackling voice of Neil Armstrong. And indeed, just to think of how the pinnacles the world stands on sometimes descend into pits, just think of the life stories of the two Armstrongs, Neil and Lance. And you will readily know from that, that is not just Oscar Pistorius, whose hero to zero transformation is either unique or local. But just to stay with technology for a moment, if you look at the basic smartphone in your pocket or average phone and all its apps, from answering machines to alarm clocks to newspapers to maps to cameras to music, you will immediately see that the future in no way even resembles the recent past. And for those of you who've got shopping centers, you know what I mean. Because we used to buy each of those things separately in separate stores, which we can now get in a mobile phone, in a telephone, which weighs no more than a few grams, and you can fit into your pocket. Now, there is, in my view, a direct connection between these transcending changes and our political path, especially since our ruling party held its conference in Mangaung and the road ahead to the 2014 elections in South Africa next year. Because while ideas and technologies move across the world and leapfrog national borders with the energy of a determined virus and make nation states, even our nation state, shrink and sometimes national borders seem irrelevant, it is equally true that natural resources exist only within countries. And this brings me to the essence of what property owners, brokers, and investors do with themselves. You don't need me to tell you, you do it every day. You buy, sell, rent, and mortgage land and buildings within defined jurisdictions, our jurisdiction of South Africa. So what goes on here, what will happen here, matters mightily despite this huge revolution which has shrunk the nation state in so many ways. Now, you will know the next gentleman, Dick Cheney, was famous or infamous for all that happened in and around Iraq and Afghanistan as a hugely consequential vice president to President George W. Bush. But before Vice President Cheney went into the White House, he was famously the CEO of Halliburton, one of the most significant oil supply companies in the world. And at that time, he said something which I want to share with you today. He said, "The good Lord did not see fit to put oil and gas only where there are democratically elected regimes friendly to the United States. We have to go where the business is." Now, it might be added to that the good Lord did not see fit to put the world's largest reserves of manganese and platinum group metals and its fourth largest diamond industry and the major home of gold reserves in a place which always practices wise policies and provides investor certainty or peaceful labor relations. The place he chose to place his bounty is in our home, South Africa. Now, it was, as mentioned, my recent high honor to represent our country abroad. Argentina, where I was based, is a spectacular example of resource riches. It produces enough food to feed 500 million people in the world every year. It has the world's third largest reserves of shale gas. But it is equally the home of spectacular bad governance. Its nationalizing and asset-grabbing president, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, practices what Julius Malema used to preach about on a bad day. The only difference is that she does it from a position of supreme power, and she does it in Espanol. So, for all the uncertainties that surround the protection of property and its ownership in our neck of the woods, more of which in a moment, I can assure you that across the South Atlantic, it is in many ways more hazardous. But in fact, while I was away in South America, I learned the answer to a question which had begun to perplex me almost from the moment that President Zuma had appointed me his emissary in the 3 southern tip countries of South America. And the question was this: why, until fairly recently, has South America lagged so far behind North America in terms of economic and political achievements? Now, you know, the great philosopher Woody Allen said something very important. He said 80% of your success in life is just about showing up. So the fact that you're here today is a very important event, you see. But I showed up for 5 months as a fellow at Harvard University in 2007 after I'd stood down as the DA leader. And I had the great gift, just simply by being there, of meeting some of the mega intellectuals in the world. And undoubtedly, one of the most consequential and controversial of them was this man, Neil Ferguson, who's the professor of history at Harvard University. And I got to know Neil well, and I attended his lectures, and we became friendly, but that's irrelevant. What is highly relevant is when I got to South America in 2009, he just published a new book called Civilization, the West and the Rest. And he provided, in its pages, under the chapter on property, the compelling answer to that dilemma. Why did the North, over 400 or 500 years, do so much better than the South on so many of the indicators which matter? He wrote, "The North and South America are one of history's biggest natural experiments. Take 2 Western cultures, export them in the 17th century, and impose them on a wide range of different peoples and lands. The British in the north of America, and the Spanish and the Portuguese in the south. And then, over several hundred years, see which one does better. It was no contest. No one doubts that the United States is the dominant force, and until very recently, Latin America has lagged far behind. But the point is this: at the point of conquest, at the point of colonial conquest in the Americas, it wasn't a contest either, because all the riches, all the gold, all the silver, all the treasures were in the south. While in the north of America, in the words of one of its early settlers, Carolina consisted of a boneyard of bleached tree trunks. Now, according to Ferguson, the big difference was the difference in the founding idea in the South and in the North. He says it was an idea that made the difference between British and Iberian America. An idea about the way people govern themselves, the foundation of the rule of law, the sanctity of individual freedom, and crucially, the security of private property rights in the North, which ensured its success, while in the South, these features were mired in underdevelopment because they were absent. In fact, Professor Ferguson and other students and scholars have proven that it is property rights and the rule of law as a means of protecting them, which not only forms the basis of stable government and societies everywhere, but is one of what he calls the killer apps, the ideas and institutions which allowed the West to outpace the rest of the world for 500 years. And as the rest of the world is starting to outpace the West, it is because some of those crucial ideas and principles have been transferred across those boundaries. And so as those institutions have spread from India to Botswana and around the world, we see that prosperity increases generally with them. Now, here in South Africa, at our constitutional negotiations, CODESA, and the multi-party negotiation process, which alongside Patricia and some others in this room I was privileged to participate in, it was the issue of property and its protection, which was a central and dominating issue in our constitutional debate then and now. And I recall SAPOA, incidentally, also in the thick of the fight between 1993 and 1996 to ensure that our Constitution provided protection for the right to property ownership. However, as you heard earlier this morning from our very distinguished Deputy Chief Justice, Justice Dikgang Moseneke, the exclusion of the black majority from land ownership for most of our history and certainly the dominant part of the 20th century was a defining and disfiguring aspect of our history, and this too had to be accommodated and accounted for in the writing of our Constitution. And so the final document, the foundation stone, if you like, of the South Africa we now live in and under whose rules we are governed by, was a compromise or a balance between securing the future and righting the wrongs of the past. Thus, the property clause in our Constitution reflects this balance. The final Constitution in Section 25 protects private property from the confiscation by the state and requires the payment of compensation in the event of an expropriation. But the same clause also states that its provisions must not impede the state from achieving land, water, and related reform in order to redress the results of past discrimination. Now, you will know that since 1994, the government has embarked on a major program of land reform, while private rights to ownership over water and mineral rights now vest in the state, not in the hands of private individuals. Now, I don't want to give any of you, after the splendid lunch you've enjoyed, indigestion, but perhaps I should simply highlight and note two recent developments that have thrown the protection of property rights into the open once again. The first was a landmark Constitutional Court judgment earlier this month, where in the Agri SA case, the Constitutional Court concluded, contrary to the findings of the Supreme Court of Appeal, that the requirements of the Mineral and Petroleum Resource Development Act meant that mineral rights were no longer constituted under the species of what we call private property. And the second, if you like, light which started to flash just in the last few days is the newly redrafted expropriation bill of 2013. Now, you know, when I was dealing with my colleagues and running the opposition and my staff in my embassy, I always used to try to lighten things up by saying, do you want the good news or the bad news? And people generally prefer the good news. So let me start with the good news on this expropriation bill. The good news is that it is an improvement on the 2008 expropriation draft, because it explicitly allows the courts and not the state to decide the issue of compensation. The bad news is, from my perspective, it introduces significant expansions of state rights and a diminution of owners' rights at the same time. But I need to say something, and it's not because I've drunk the Kool-Aid or I've become a happy clappy for all that's good. I just have some, perhaps, distance and perspective, to quote Queen Elizabeth. When I left South Africa in 2009, there was a bill of such severity on the parliamentary table, the State Protection of Information Bill, which would have massively curbed the rights or the ability to acquire information. And I said to my wife as we got onto the plane going to Buenos Aires, if this bill is passed in its present form, I cannot see myself being an ambassador to a country that legislates like that. I came back 3.5 years later, the bill still hadn't been finalized in Parliament because there was a huge pushback by the whole of society, civil society, the opposition, the media. And the bill was finally enacted 2 weeks ago. Far from good or perfect, but much better than it was in its original form, precisely because people stood up and the governing party listened. And I'm suggesting that as empowered citizens, whether you're in the world of property, whether you are simply concerned South Africans, that you also need to stand up and fight your corner, because we live in a democracy, not under an authoritarian, totalitarian regime. And going on to property, there is something uniquely South African about the compromises. It is like trying to ride two horses at once, one of which pulls you in one direction and the other one which pulls you in another direction. And political leadership, whatever its composition, has to ride both those horses at once and try not to fall over. Now, the question in this hinge year, 2013 is a hinge year, because 2012 we had this ANC elective conference. 2014, next April, we've got a general election. So 2013, hope my rabbi will forgive me, is the ham and the sandwich, you see, between those two crusts. So the question is, what options are we going to pursue? Where are we going? Will we continue to make down payments for the past? Will we provide a serviceable mortgage for the future? Will we try and do both and just muddle along? Now, one of the more remarkable personalities, and on the Woody Allen principle, you do the jobs I've done, you meet kind of a lot of people, aside from Richard Quest, incidentally, but almost as distinguished. And one of the more remarkable people I met just as I started off life as a member of Parliament in the 1990s was a guy called Bill Keller, who at the time was the Johannesburg bureau chief of the New York Times. And of course, when he left South Africa, he went on, as so many people do when they leave South Africa, to become the editor-in-chief of this hugely important world opinion maker, the New York Times. And just last month, Bill Keller, looking back at South Africa now and then, wrote the following. He said, if South Africa does not leave you full of ambivalence, you have not been paying attention. It is a country where the ruling alliance includes the Communist Party, but the real economic power is capitalist, where corruption is rampant, but a vigorous press reports it, where the Constitutional Court legalized gay marriage and lesbians are gang raped, where the shopping malls are populated by a multiracial consumer class and millions of people live in shacks. It is inspiring and dispiriting all at the same time. And that is our country. And I'm going to show you that there's plenty of evidence for the good, the bad, and the somewhere in between. And you yourself will be familiar with the contradictions. And nothing perhaps illustrates it better than my own short ambassadorship abroad. It started with the FIFA Football World Cup, a moment of such universal exceptionalism, especially in football-mad South America, where just on the back of that huge, well-executed event in South Africa, we managed to increase the number of Argentine arrivals by 122% in 1 year. Because everyone in Argentina loves football, incidentally, in case you didn't know. And we, after all, we being Argentina, produced Lionel Messi. We also gave you the first non-European Pope in the world last month, and even the new Queen of the Netherlands all came from Argentina. But the point about it was that South Africa excited South America with that event. And that's how, even if I'd been, blind, deaf, drunk, and stupid, and hopefully not all those things at once, any ambassador could have made a success out of that. But as I was leaving Argentina, we had that, Maracana, just down the road here. And this was South Africa. You stand on pinnacles of huge accomplishment, and they descend very quickly into precipices of national despair. But the truth of the matter is this, that we have, on the one hand, one of the most admired young democracies in the world. We have, on the other hand, what is called the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality, which measures South Africa at 0.63. And most unequal societies are at 1, and the most equal are at 0. And we are rated now as one of the most unequal countries on the face of the planet. We have a very big, smiling, big-hearted unifier as our president, yet the same president presides over a government which faces serious issues of sleaze, corruption, and falling credit ratings. And as we have seen, Africa, our continent, is rising on all the metrics, and yet the overall continental growth powers along, admittedly from a small base, at about 6% GDP per annum, and we are stuck in the mud here in South Africa, somewhere between 2 and 3%. Yet the recent census, which was published late last year, reminds us of our significant achievements since 1994. Over the past 19 years, there have been great improvements in the living conditions of all South Africans, in all age groups and across the economic spectrum. Service delivery, incidentally and ironically given the protests that often surround it, has been one of the signal successes of this government despite the racial legacy it inherited. On almost all measures, and some of them are really quite dramatic, the number of households in South Africa today with access to formal houses, electricity, education, and clean water has increased dramatically. The reality, incidentally, is quite contrary to what many South Africans actually believe. And just one statistic bears this out. The number of people in South Africa living on what is accepted today as the global measure of extreme poverty, which is less than $2 a day, has fallen from 12% when apartheid ended to less than 5% today. But then there is the other South Africa. The census released a few months ago remind us that our country has a youth bulge in its 51.7 million population, which is going to rise to 53.7 million in 2035. And on the narrow definition of unemployment, 33.7% of the most explosive demographic sector, in other words, translated from this gobbledygook, it means the people who've got the least to use, who are the youngest, who are the most restless, who feel the most disempowered, that more than 1/3 of them, on a narrow definition, are without work and are very unlikely to find work going forward. And that figure only marginally declines to 27.4% in the next cohort, 30 to 34-year-olds. And while there has been a 30% increase in overall household income in the past decade in our country, whites, who constitute an ever-shrinking demographic, still earn 6 times more on average than blacks, an explosive differential going forward. Our estimable Minister of Finance, Pravin Gordhan, incidentally, I brought him to Argentina because the public books are so bad in Argentina. They want to see, can you get the books of a country right? And I said, I'll bring along a bloke. And Pravin came and he wowed the crowds in Buenos Aires with his stewardship of our economy. But he pointed out in his recent budget speech that the social wage, the transfers that government makes from your pocket to poor people to give them child support grants and old age pensions, and which accounts for the impressive delivery of the services mentioned above, now reaches 16 million South Africans, set to rise in 2 years' time to 17.3 million. But only 4.3 million South Africans have paid income tax directly in 2011. That is one of the greatest imbalances in the world of welfare anywhere you go in the globe. And the other thing is, and your audience reflects it today, is that our elite is very multiracial. Something like half, or just under half, of the 20% richest South Africans are no longer white. But the problem is that the 20% of the richest in this country controls 72% of our national income, while the poorest, which is mostly black, have, at 40% of the poorest in this country, have only access to 6% of the national income of South Africa. And although the racial composition of the top layer has changed very dramatically, those ratios between what the rich have and what the poor have hardly changed at all in the last 2 decades. And you will know much more famously or notoriously that in the past 20 years, the number of children in schools and matriculating has risen quite dramatically. We spend 6% of our GDP on education, one of the highest expenditures in the whole world today, but the outputs and the outcomes from that education system are among the worst in the world. Just one statistic here illustrates this. The 2011 WEF Global Competitiveness Survey, our maths and science results meant that South Africa was second bottom of the 144 country survey, coming in at country number 143. And finally, there is something that you experience, I think, every day of your lives. There is a disconnect between a very skilled and high-performing private sector in with some very impressive exceptions, underperforming public sector. At the very moment when anti-business sentiment and demands for the wholesale adoption of a developmental state to fuel growth and create jobs is at its height. And so, the same global benchmarks and surveys reveal this huge contradiction. We get the highest marks in the world for the regulation of our security exchanges. We get the 6th highest ranking in the world for our banking sector and its soundness. We get number 3 pole position in the world for the accountability of our private institutions. And we right down there at the bottom of the world when it comes to favoritism in government decision-making, 102 out of 144, labor relations, 144 out of 144, and flexibility in wage determinations, 140 out of 144. And all this is happening in the same country. And so we face, in our present, some very uncertain paths into the future. Now, I was inspired when I saw that Pravin Gordhan had in his budget speech announced that we are going to fund a 300 billion rand Transnet CapEx program to boost both transport and mining sectors, to make the following analogies. Now, I'm making the assumption that that 300 billion is not going to be lost in corruption, underspending, and all the other ailments of our public procurement. But what it did was to inspire me to suggest that there are 3 tracks into the future. The fast track towards virtuous and inclusive growth, the collision track, which crashes our country into a failed state, and a merger of the two, which I've called the dirt track. Let me just start with the fast track. Now, you know, I'm like a mini Rip van Winkle. I go away to South America, I come back, and here's the Gautrain. And, you know, there are very few countries, and no country in South America has put together such a magnificent beast moving as quickly or efficiently as the Gautrain. And that should be the symbol, the aspiration that we want for our whole country. And in many ways, getting onto that fast track of growth is not a mystery. It doesn't exist in some philosopher's stone buried deep in the woods. The Spence Commission on Growth and Development in 2008 provided the formula, although its basis stretches back into millennia. It said, growth is not a mysterious force which strikes unpredictably or whose absence is inexplicable. On the contrary, economic growth is the fruit of 2 forces. The ability of people to recognize opportunities on the one hand, and the creation by government of the legal, fiscal, and regulatory framework in which it becomes worthwhile to exploit those opportunities. And since there is no shortage of energetic and entrepreneurial people wherever human beings are found, one of the most important factors explaining differences between winning nations and failing nations will be public policy. The key is simply to put sensible policies in place and then let the intelligence, industriousness, and ingenuity of the people do the rest. Now, amazingly, it's not the same words. Almost exactly the same formula appears in, to me, Exhibit B of South Africa's fast-track potential, and that is the National Development Plan Diagnostic of the NPC. Because in its conclusion, it writes the following: successful countries have what is called a future orientation. Their policy bias is to take decisions that lead to long-term benefits, as opposed to short-run solutions that could have negative effects later on. Such countries generally prefer investment over consumption, have high savings rates, sound fiscal policy, high levels of fixed investment, a high degree of policy certainty, and clear rules of engagement for the private sector. Now, that wasn't written by me, it wasn't written by Professor Spence, it was written by people like Cyril Ramaphosa, Bobby Godsell, Trevor Manuel, Vincent Mapai, and others who formed the National Planning Commission. Now, the good news is that Trevor Manuel has a senior seat at the cabinet table. The further good news is that the deputy chairman who wrote that very good formula is Cyril Ramaphosa, who was recently enthroned as deputy president of the ruling party and could be the next president of South Africa. And the best news is that President Zuma announced earlier this year that the report of the NPC is going to be front and center of all government policy and action. The bad news is that Minister Manuel, I think, is probably in his last year in public office, and there are contrary, arguably even more powerful voices at the same cabinet table who don't support the NDP at all, or with serious qualification. The good news is, and I'm living proof of this, that the President of South Africa is a good listener. The bad news is that he's not necessarily a good decider. But there are other factors that will place South Africa on a fast track. Number one, the bad choices we made, and we've made quite a lot of them in the last few years, do get punished by the markets. And our economy, unique in Africa, is internationally exposed. Nearly 40% of our bond market and nearly half of our stock exchange is owned by international investors. Number two, there is a much more competitive political environment and indeed a much more open dialogue today in South Africa than there ever was during the heights or depths of my own political career. I mean, the fact is, you have a highly critical black voice and a highly critical white voice speaking out today, which wasn't the case even 10 years ago. You've got a vibrant and free press, buttressing an engaged civil society. The courts and the Constitution are still more or less intact and provide some protection against a wholesale derailment of the fast-track outlook. The risk of South Africa becoming another Zimbabwe is small for one very simple objective reason. Only 3% of our GDP arises from agriculture. So even if there's a ruination of our farmlands, won't be good for our food security, the whole South African economy isn't dependent on it. And quite frankly, there are so many people today in the government and the governing party, I don't necessarily approve it, who themselves are in business, as it were, that they don't necessarily support bad market outcomes because they're looking at their own pensions and investment. We are also on the cusp, as you famously heard, and I think it's true, of the African century. But South Africa now has to compete against countries like Nigeria and Ghana for gateway to Africa status. And that competition is very good for the improvement of our political economy. Now, the outcome for business is clearly enmeshed, and you living proof of this, in what goes on here. But equally, in our top 60 companies, 56% of their earnings come from offshore. So actually, you can have two tracks in South Africa. The country might go along or not on the fast track, but a lot of our most important corporates actually are going to fast track themselves because they operate in international markets. And I'm living proof of quite how brilliant those multinationals are in places like South America. I also will predict from, I've got the scars on my back from leading the opposition in the older days in South Africa, that I think next year's election will see an improvement in the fortunes of opposition and a decline somewhat in the fortunes of the governing party. Now that you don't have to be an ANC or a DA supporter to think that that's a good or a bad idea. The truth is, the more competitive our politics become, the greater the democratic and economic health of our country. Well, that's the good news. The next slide suggests we could also be on a collision track. And that is simply because there's also evidence to support this. In the elegant and highly diplomatic language of the National Planning Commission, unless some tough and difficult choices are made very soon, we will be beset by an array of combustible forces: high unemployment, poor education, bad service delivery, endemic corruption, and heightened racial and class divisions. And it wasn't my opinion or the usual suspects. In the plain language of the crowd that gave us a downgrade, mind you, they themselves have got some issues, Moody's, given how they rated the subprime market in the USA and all the securitized, collateralized debt obligations, that's another story. Moody's said when they downgraded us, there is a reduced capacity in South Africa for the authorities to handle the current political and economic situation and to implement effective strategies to place the country on the path to faster and more inclusive growth. What that tells us in plain language is that business as usual will not suffice. And then there's everything else that you know. The property compromise I spoke to you about at the beginning in our constitution is being unpicked. There are some resolutions that came out of Mangaung which I think are very troubling. Undoing the willing seller, willing buyer principle is one. Banning in the future foreign land ownership to me is crazy. I will tell you that the biggest single tranche of foreign direct investment I helped bring in here was an investment of 100 million rand by the biggest Argentine fresh citrus producer who invested in the farmlands of the Eastern Cape and the Sundays River Valley and has created work for 750 people there. Now, what do we achieve by banning foreign land ownership? Who does it help? You might restrict it, you might, and I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it's been put on the table. On the other hand, of course, you've also got COSATU. And the might of COSATU and even the ANC and others today is showing signs of fracture, splits, and divisions. Now, that can be bad or it can be good, and we need to see, because we don't quite know how that will play out. Now, there are some very respectable commentators. Moletsi and Mbeki one, our Deputy President Motlanthe is another, who have said that if we just continue these present trends, South Africa by 2020 will reach what he called, Mr. Mbeki, the Tunisia moment, where it explodes. I personally don't think that will happen. Not because, again, I'm an incurable optimist, on the contrary. I simply think that in South Africa we have a host of feedback mechanisms, ranging from the right to vote, to all those civil society institutions, to the social media, which completely overleaps the kind of traditional boundaries of the public and the private, as we know, which actually allow public anger to be channeled and sometimes answer. And Marikana, for all that it represents that is bad about South Africa, and for all that it might yet tip over again, is still the exception and not the rule. But if we avoid the collision track, and we don't get on the fast track, we could be on what I call the dirt track. And that is, we do a bit of this and a bit of that. We have drift, but we have sufficient compromise at critical moments as we peer over the edge of the precipice. So you damage investor sentiment, but you more or less keep the country on its current path of low growth, patchy but basically sufficient delivery, bad but sufficient basic education, and a continuation of what I call the enclave state, with some but few centers of excellence, such as the Treasury, SARS, unfortunately, the courts, the city of Cape Town, let me add, where I'm happy to live, and the private component of the private-public partnership. This is an unexciting and insufficient prospectus for a winning nation, but it does keep failed state status at bay for the next decade or two. Now, personally speaking, I would go longer on track 3, that we do a bit of this and a bit of that, shorter on option 1 at the moment, unfortunately, the fast track, and I would, for the reasons I've tried to elaborate, heavily discount track 2, that we're on a collision course. Still, we have often surprised ourselves in the world when we have chosen the better alternative, often after experiencing and coming close to all the other worse alternatives. Now, just before I left Buenos Aires, I was in the presence of this gifted speaker. And believe me, I'm a very cheap date in comparison. He charges 250,000 rand for 2 nights with some friends of mine in Buenos Aires. And President Clinton has an amazing ability to express what you're kind of thinking in one paragraph. And he said at this dinner something that was both simple and profound and certainly of universal relevance. He said, and I quote, "The more we stay in the future business and the less we continue voting for a better yesterday, the better our options and the more likely the fast track will come within our reach." And let me just in final conclusion. On the 6th of November, after I'd come back, I had my final exit meeting with President Zuma. And to the extent that you're interested in a little bit of what happened, I don't go into all the private details. There's a book outside you can go and buy. But you know, the book also deals with my incredible struggle with the Spanish language, idioma español, which is another story. Much worse, baie meer swak as my Afrikaans. But when I drove into what used to be called Libertas, which is the president's residence in Pretoria to meet President, I remarked on coming in and talking to President Zuma, I said, you know, when I first came here as a backbench MP in 1990, the other President de Klerk, not Estienne, F4 was the president, and I said this place was called Libertas, and now I see it is called Mhlamba and Shlofu. And my Shangaan is even worse than my Spanish, which is worse than my Afrikaans. So I said, excuse me, Mr. President, what does actually Mhlamba and Shlofu mean? He says, it means the new dawn. And I thought, that's a very good change of name, because the new dawn always arises in Africa. Thank you very much.